afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Richardson, Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and welcome to our program today. Today's workshop in artificial intelligence, or as we all call it these days, AI, is on the topic of ethics and fairness in artificial intelligence. Our presenter will be introduced in just a moment, but I'd like to take just a couple of slides and introduce you to a broader perspective of ethics in AI in the public eye these days. So my first slide is a summary chart from a paper entitled AI in the Headlines, Portrayal of the Ethical Issues of Artificial Intelligence in the Media. This paper was published this year, 2020, in March 2020, and it is a study of the media references to AI ethics over the last previous 5 years, from 2013 to 2018. As you can see, there has been a huge climb in media coverage of the issues of ethics in AI. And in this particular chart, the blue striped section at the top of each of the columns indicates the proportion of the papers that are judged to be critical of the AI applications that were discussed in the papers. There are also many papers which are highly complimentary, but a lot of the press is now entering into a phase where it is balanced in its view, talking about both sides of the subject. We think that it's time for the ethics of artificial intelligence to become more deeply ingrained at the University of Florida and in our college, because it is becoming an important social issue. I do want to point out that the journal in which this paper was published, AI and Society, is a Springer journal, but it was first published in 1987. So even in 1987, there was a recognition that there were impacts of the use and potential of artificial intelligence in our society. On the other hand, what this chart shows, is that in recent years, ethics and concepts of fairness have become quite prevalent in the literature or in the popular press. Another data point that I'll show you is a book which Duncan Purves will mention here later today. But this is a book written by Cathy O'Neil entitled Weapons of Math Destruction. Cathy O'Neil's background was in mathematics and technology, and she actually started in the finance industry, making money using the tools and techniques to understand and create the data which would allow for positive, successful investments in the markets. She became disillusioned with many aspects of these algorithms and the impact that they were having on society back in the early 2010s, and eventually wrote this book, Weapons of Math Destruction. You can see on the bottom left there that it won many, many prizes from both the technical press, the technical popular press, and the mass media markets like New York Times. What's interesting is that here we are in 2020, this book is now 4 years old, and you'll notice on the Amazon page today that it is the #1 best-selling book in business statistics. It is the #1 best-selling book in data processing, and it's the second highest selling book in privacy and surveillance in society. So this book is an illustration of how pervasive this subject is becoming in both industry and increasingly so in academics. So with that, I would like to welcome you once again. Thank you for joining us. And at this point, I will turn the Zoom room over to Associate Dean David Ferries, who will be our moderator today. David?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. And I would like to introduce our speaker for today and then lay down a couple of the rules we're going to be following. Our speaker is Dr. Duncan Purves. He has been assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy since fall of 2017. His PhD in philosophy is from the University of Colorado. And his areas of interest are ethics overall, ethical theory, applied ethics, bioethics, and what interests us today especially, ethics of technology. And he has developed a very, very interesting subspecialization in ethics and artificial intelligence. One of the issues he has written about, for example, is autonomous weapon systems, that is, weapon systems that kill without human oversight. And he recently received an NSF grant to investigate another very important issue in AI, which is the use of policing algorithms, so-called predictive policing, which can lead to discrimination against certain groups. Today, I know many of you will end up having questions. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A button. You can register your questions at any time during the talk. I will be the moderator of the question and answer session, in the sense that once the talk is over, I will be choosing questions from among those that have been submitted, and I will ask Dr. Purves to answer them given the amount of time that is available to us. So without further ado, then I would like to hand over the screen to Dr. Purves for his talk. Thank you very much, Dr. Purves.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. I'm just running to a last-minute Zoom complication with my presentation, but I think we'll have it up in just a second here. Okay, here we are. And okay, hopefully you all can see that. David, let me know if something looks wrong on my screen. So today I want to discuss some of the emerging ethical issues facing artificial intelligence and contemporary data science. Algorithms help determine who is admitted to college, who's hired and fired, where and when to police, whom we date, who gets a loan, what advertisements and discounts we see, and what stories enter our newsfeed. Designing data science models responsibly, I want to suggest, requires understanding the ethical issues surrounding the data we obtain and use, the algorithms we employ, and their impact on people. I'm going to begin the discussion today with a very brief sort of introduction or discussion of the subject matter of ethics. I'll then look at ethical issues for the collection and use of a person's data. After this, I will talk about ethical issues that arise when algorithms are applied to real-world decision-making that affects people's lives. And I'm going to try to illustrate each point with examples throughout the presentation. I hope that the presentation will make clear just how challenging it can be to create and use an algorithm that aligns with our values. Indeed, as we will see, sometimes we must think deeply about what those values really are. I want to close the discussion by discussing an emerging and important critique of artificial intelligence and data science, which looks at the way that existing power structures in society can be the source of ethical challenges for AI and big data. So to begin, what are ethics? Well, that's an entire course on its own. But one way to think about ethics is as a set of principles or rules that determine how we ought to act. An ability to think ethically is one of the features of humans that distinguishes us from animals. You know, as a philosopher, I like to say that ethics are a cornerstone of civilization. Now, laws prohibit me from stealing your car, and this might motivate me not to do it because I could get caught and put in jail. Non-legal consequences might also motivate me. I might be unsuccessful and you would catch me and beat me up. However, in the end, I think that a commitment to ethical principles is what really stops me from stealing your car. Ethics go beyond laws or self-interest. If you tell me a secret and I promise not to tell it, but then I do, it's not a crime. It might damage my reputation with others if they find out, or I could lose your friendship if you find out. But these are not the only reasons that I would give for keeping the secret. I would simply say, because I promised I would keep it. Or what I mean is, given that I promised I would keep the secret, keeping it is the right thing to do. In this case, a commitment to doing the right thing motivates me to keep my promise. People who believe that their only moral reasons for acting are to promote their own interests are what we might call egoists, and people who deny that there are any moral reasons for acting at all are called nihilists. Now, I don't think very many people really are egoists or nihilists, and those who are not much fun to be around. Most of us, I want to suggest, have ethical commitments of some sort or another. Ethical principles are often not encoded in law. There's no general legal prohibition against telling your friends secrets. However, laws often follow ethics insofar as laws are often created to enforce our shared, strong ethical commitments. And we might critique our laws if they no longer align with our firm ethical commitments. So as we'll see in many of our examples, the ethically problematic features of data science and AI applications often become apparent only after the fact. So the challenge is how to anticipate and address those features, those problematic features, before the application is deployed in the world. And I want to just flag that what I plan to do today is just sort of give a sampling of some of the key issues. Nothing I say here is meant to be exhaustive, and I'm going to raise more questions than I give answers. So, but I still hope that you find some of what I say useful in your own thinking about these issues. So the first set of ethical issues I want to discuss concerns the collection and use of a person's information or data, as that information is called once it's quantified and digitized. So data is constantly being collected about us from our cell phone cameras, our phone's GPS signal, our social media accounts, and our web surfing activity. There's a lot of recent discussion around the ethics of how data is collected, about whether we own it and should therefore have control over how and whether it is used. For example, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation gives individuals the right to ask organizations to delete their personal data. So I want to discuss some cases in which individuals' data was collected or used in ways that were ethically questionable. Before turning to those examples, though, I want to describe one framework for thinking about the ethical collection and use of data. Principles of autonomy and informed consent, beneficence and non-maleficence govern ethical conduct in human subjects research. It is an attractive idea to try to apply these principles to data science insofar as data science deals with human data subjects. Now, these principles that I have listed here are very general. It is therefore unclear whether they can guide our actions without further clarification about when and how exactly they apply in particular instances. But they might be helpful to keep in mind when we're thinking about whether the conduct in the following examples was ethically wrong. So according to the principle of autonomy, data subjects should have meaningful control over how their data is used. Respect for autonomy also requires informed consent. That is, data subjects should also be given the opportunity to explicitly approve use of their data based on a full understanding of the facts. The principle of beneficence requires that data be used in ways that subjects would recognize as beneficial, and the principle of non-maleficence requires that data not be used in harmful ways. In the first example I want to discuss, in 2012, researchers at Facebook and Cornell University manipulated the newsfeed of selected Facebook users. Some users were shown more positive articles, others were shown more negative or sad articles. People who were shown more positive articles posted more positive articles themselves. People who were shown more negative articles posted more negative articles. In other words, they demonstrated a phenomenon that the researchers called emotional contagion. Now, whether these findings are particularly interesting scientifically or socially is not really our concern. The interesting thing for our purposes here is that Facebook didn't ask anyone if they wanted to be part of the experiment. This calls into question both the legality and the ethics of the conduct of the experiment. So according to Facebook's terms of service, users relinquish the use of their data when they sign in to Facebook for data analysis, testing, and research. In defending their experiment, Facebook said, this research was conducted for a single week in 2012, and none of the data used was associated with a specific person's Facebook account. We do research to improve our services and to make the content people see on Facebook as relevant and engaging as possible. A big part of this is understanding how people respond to different types of content, etc. We carefully consider what research we do and have a strong internal review process. There is no unnecessary collection of people's data in connection with these research initiatives. Okay. So based on Facebook's terms of service, what they did does not appear to be illegal, but was it ethical? And Stephanie, are you able to bring up that poll for me now? We'll just do a very simple one-question survey. I'm curious about your intuitions. What do you think? Was Facebook's experiment ethically wrong or ethically okay? After all, they do state in their terms of service that you are permitting the use of your data for these types of purposes when you use their platform. Oh, it looks like I can take the poll too. All right, let's do it. I didn't know I could do that. So Facebook, so we can explore your reasons, the reasons you answered why you did in the Q&A if you'd like to. So Facebook social psychologist Adam Kramer himself ultimately doubted whether the experiment was the right thing to do. He said, at the end of the day, the actual impact of people in the experiment, or on people in the experiment, was the minimal amount required to statistically detect it. However, having written and designed this experiment myself, I can tell you that our goal was never to upset anyone. In hindsight, the research benefits of the paper may not have justified all this anxiety. Oh, all right, there we go. So was the Facebook experiment an instance of human subjects research? And what are the implications for the ethics of that type of work if it is an instance of human subjects research? What are the general implications, ethical implications for organizations such as Facebook and Google? In human subjects research, there is a notion of informed consent, which is required by the principle of autonomy. That is, subjects must understand what is being done to them, they must voluntarily consent to the experiment, and they must have the right to withdraw consent at any time. Now, it's far from clear that those conditions were satisfied in the Facebook case. So if you do think that informed consent is required for ethical experimentation on social media users, there are several issues or several challenges for acquiring informed consent for the collection and use of a person's data in experiments like the one that Facebook conducted. First, the terms of consent are frequently difficult to understand and buried in fine print. Most of us ignore the terms of usage and just click through when it comes to websites like Facebook. Most of us ignore the term. Second, it's difficult to control how data, once it's collected, could be used in the future. It's difficult to keep track of how it's copied and reused. And this calls into question whether informed consent really was obtained by Facebook users when they signed the user agreement. Could they have possibly anticipated that, that they might be manipulated in these ways? An important ethical question to think about in this context, then, is whether the relationship between data subjects and data scientists or programmers and social media companies is really akin to the relationship between medical researchers and their subjects. That is, do data scientists really have the same sorts of obligations to data subjects that medical researchers have to their subjects? And if not, why not? On to a second example. During OkCupid's Love is Blind Day, OkCupid being the popular dating site, OkCupid suppressed photographs in user profiles so that customers could not see profile photographs of potential people, potential matches. Customers could still read what was written in profiles, for example, their interests or their educational background or something like that. They couldn't see them. And an effect of this was that people had much longer conversations with each other until the photos were restored, not surprisingly. In other experiments, they took people with low compatibility scores and told them it was high, and they took people with high compatibility scores and told them it was low. Again, we can ask, was this legal and was this ethical? Well, OkCupid's CEO was unapologetic for their social experiments. As he put it, guess what, everybody? If you use the internet, you're the subject of hundreds of experiments at any given time on every site. That's how websites work. And indeed, Google changes rankings, Facebook A/B tests user functionality and recommendations, and so on. On the other hand, having a company intentionally lie to you, intentionally give you a wrong score, particularly if you're a paying customer, is something that many people consider ethically unacceptable. It's both deceptive and potentially harmful. I want to actually talk about one more point here really quickly. It is true that on websites, you're regularly manipulated in various ways to find out, for the sake of improving user functionality. So for example, go back here. Here's an example of, on the right side of the screen, an A/B test, simple A/B test. So it's two versions of a website. One is, one presents this sort of this discount offer for pre-ordering the game SimCity. The other does not. And it's a very simple A/B test to find out if more people purchase the pre-order with or without that offer on the screen. Right? So it's like a very, very simple experiment. But nobody objects to that sort of experimentation. So we might ask what the difference is between that and Facebook and OkCupid's social experiments. I now want to talk about some challenges with data and privacy protection. Privacy is a basic human need. We need a protected sphere of control over certain information about ourselves and our lives. We need this control over our information in part because controlling information about ourselves helps us shape our relationships with other people. Part of what makes my relationship to my wife a special one is that I choose to share information about myself with her that I would not share with my colleagues. In a world where everyone had perfect information about me, this selective sharing would not be possible. Privacy also protects us from bad actors who would use our personal information to harm us. It's not hard to imagine the possible harm of being outed as transgender on social media, or having had an elective abortion, or having a history of substance abuse, or having contracted HIV. And privacy is not all or nothing. Right? We have more or less of it to the extent that we control access to information about ourselves. When we lose control over access to our personal data, we lose some degree of privacy. Now, as I said at the start of this whole talk, Data about us is everywhere. It's constantly collected. And this data is incredibly useful, both for researchers and for private firms. For example, being able to use data about individuals' mental or physical health condition, current prescriptions, past provision of healthcare, and demographic information might be crucial for the development of novel medicines or diagnostic medical tools. The problem is how to share this sensitive data without leading to harmful consequences for the people whose data it is. A common thought is that de-identifying the data is enough to protect privacy by removing any information that would make the data traceable to the person whose data it is. But what identifiable information must be removed from data to protect the identity of individuals? In a Massachusetts re-identification incident, the General Health Insurance Commission released de-identified health records, which included information about individuals' zip code, birth date, and sex. And a woman by the name of LaTanya Sweeney used this information to locate the health record of then Governor William Weld. And she was able to, using only this information, look up his diagnoses and health prescriptions, inferring a great deal about his personal health history. And this event was ended up being pivotal in revisions to the HIPAA privacy rule to restrict the disclosure of a person's full birth date and zip codes. Now, the question of how and whether data you release is safe, i.e. whether or not you can be identified using the released data, is a topic that has been recently well studied in the computer science community. One notion that has been formalized is what's called differential privacy, which is a notion pioneered by researcher Cynthia Dwork. The aim of differential privacy is to provide as much statistical information as possible from data stored in a database, while introducing enough noise to the data to guarantee that an individual cannot be identified by it. So differential privacy ensures, for example, that a person can contribute their genetic information to a medical database without fear that anyone who's analyzing the database will be able to figure out which genetic information is hers, or even whether she's participated in the database at all. And it achieves a security guarantee in a way that allows researchers to use the database to make new discoveries. And ideas from this research on differential privacy are now finding their way into a lot of different practices involving big data. Okay, so I've discussed some issues related to the collection and use of a person's personal information, personal data. I now want to turn to some ethical issues arising for the use of algorithms in making important decisions affecting people's lives. So most algorithmic systems fundamentally are classification systems. That is, they're designed to classify subjects into groups of interest. When the algorithm is designed well, the classifications they make will correspond to real-world outcomes. Therefore, a simplistic approach to algorithm development is that our only goal should be to maximize classification accuracy. Right? What else could we want? However, I think things are a bit more complicated than that. The real challenge I want to suggest is how to make algorithmic systems promote or support human social values, including ethical values. And I think optimizing for this is much more complex than optimizing for mere accuracy. One place where algorithms can go ethically awry is when data used to train the algorithm are not representative of the population we want to classify. So one example of this is predictive policing, which is something that I've been doing some research on recently. Predictive policing systems use algorithms trained on historical crime data to predict when and where crime is most likely to occur. This little display on the right side of your screen there with the red boxes is a display from the PredPol predictive policing algorithm. Each of those boxes is about a 500 by 500 square foot box identifying a high risk area of crime. A serious concern about some of these predictive policing systems is that their forecasts are based in part on arrest data. And arrest data are biased and hence unrepresentative, and hence an unrepresentative reflection of neighborhood crime rates. Arrest data is susceptible to bias in the sense that arrest statistics can be driven by historical racial bias by police officers. The idea here is that police disproportionately look for crime in Black communities, so they find more crime in Black communities, and so they arrest more people there. We should therefore expect algorithmic forecasts based on arrest data simply to replicate any discriminatory policing practices against communities of color. What some people have called a vicious feedback loop can occur when algorithms trained on biased arrest data recommend greater police presence in communities of color. Once there are more officers in a community, this will yield more arrests, which will be used as a proxy for higher crime rates, which are then used to justify placing more police in those communities, and on the cycle goes. So here we have a case where unrepresentative training data can lead to an inefficient and discriminatory use of policing resources. As we've just seen, algorithmic classifications are increasingly used to shape the life prospects of ordinary people. It's therefore important that determinations of these algorithms classify people in ways that align with our shared commitment to fairness. For example, we wouldn't think it's ethically acceptable to offer for a bank to offer one set of lending terms to minority applicants and another set of lending terms to white applicants. But as recent work has shown, most notably and popularly in the book Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil, discrimination that we reject in normal life can creep into algorithms. So fairness has been studied in philosophy, social choice theory, game theory, economics, and law, to name only a few disciplines. But measuring fairness has become a hot topic in computer science. Now we can distinguish between two broad ways of thinking about fairness in algorithms, or trying to measure fairness in algorithms. So what we might call unfairness or discrimination concerning an individual occurs when an algorithm treats a member of a protected group differently from an otherwise identical individual, not from the protected group. What we might call group unfairness occurs when an algorithm generates a percentage of negative outcomes for members of a protected group that is greater than the percentage for individuals not in the protected group. And we will see an example of this, of group unfairness momentarily. But suppose you had a minority group in which the smart students were steered towards science and a dominant group in which the smart students were steered towards finance. Now, if somebody wanted to write a quick and dirty classifier to find smart students, they might just look for students who study finance because the majority is much bigger than the minority, right? So this is a sort of easy way to find more good students. The problem is that not only is this unfair to the minority because they will be sort of excluded entirely, but it's also less useful compared to a classifier that understands that if you're a member of the minority and you study science, you should be viewed as similar to a member of the majority who studies finance. Fairness in this context, therefore, might require a kind of cross-cultural sensitivity. And unfortunately, merely treating individuals alike, regardless of their protected group membership, does not ensure group fairness, understood as parity of positive and negative outcomes. For example, suppose that you're looking at college applications and you're thinking about using test scores as your admission criterion. If you have two racial groups that perform differently on standardized tests, then you won't get a representative sample of one of those groups in your incoming class if you only have one threshold for the standardized test score. This will violate group fairness, understood as parity of positive and negative outcomes. And if you want to see a lengthier discussion of sort of these attempts to measure fairness and adjust algorithms to be more fair, you can read the book. It's called The Ethical Algorithm, The Science of Socially Aware Algorithm Design. I meant to have a picture of that in here, but I don't. You can email me for the reference afterwards. Okay. So where algorithmic fairness is seriously called into question is in the use of algorithms in sentencing and parole. These algorithms generate a score predicting the likelihood of an individual committing a future crime. However, these risk scoring algorithms seem to lead, let me see here. Okay, what time? Okay. Where algorithmic fairness is seriously called in question, the use of algorithms in sentencing and parole. These algorithms generate a risk score predicting the likelihood of an individual committing a future crime. However, these risk scoring algorithms seem to lead to racial disparities in classification. For example, ProPublica obtained the risk scores assigned by one such algorithm to more than 7,000 people arrested in Broward County, Florida in 2013 and 2014, and checked to see how many were charged with new crimes over the next 2 years. They discovered significant racial disparities in the algorithm's forecasting. In forecasting who would reoffend, the algorithm made mistakes with Black and white defendants at roughly the same rate, but it made those mistakes in very different ways. The formula was particularly likely to falsely flag Black defendants as future criminals, wrongly labeling them this way at almost twice the rate as white defendants. And white defendants, by contrast, were mislabeled as low risk much more often than Black defendants. Now, this disparity is deeply troubling from the perspective of fairness, but I want to take a couple minutes to describe how complicated it can be to rectify this disparity in a way that aligns with our other ethical values or commitments. For while the algorithm falsely flagged Black defendants as high risk at twice the rate as whites, it was also racially neutral in an important way. First, the algorithm did not rely on race as a factor when generating risk scores. Second, and importantly, the risk scores assigned by the algorithm mean the same thing regardless of a person's race. For example, both white and Black defendants who were assigned a score of 7 out of 10 on the risk scale reoffended 60% of the time. So when a judge sees the risk score, they need not consult the defendant's race in order to understand what the risk score means in terms of the defendant's probability of reoffending. If the algorithm did not remain race blind in this sense, judges would need to take the defendant's race into account when making decisions about pretrial detention. But considering a defendant's race and making this sort of life-altering decision seems to violate our commitment to equal treatment under the law, regardless of race. Now, the tricky thing is this: because defendants reoffend at a because Black defendants reoffend at a higher rate than white defendants, 52% compared with 39%, and because Black defendants disproportionately possess features that are predictive of future offending, for example, criminal history, it's difficult to have a predictive system that is race blind in terms of the predictive accuracy of its risk scores, but which simultaneously avoids any racial disparity in its false negative and false positive rates. So this sort of unfortunate result or challenging result has been proven in several places in the computer science literature. And I can send you those references after the presentation if you're interested. So we face the following dilemma with respect to fairness. Either our algorithm can mislabel Black defendants at the same rate as white defendants, or the algorithm's risk categories can mean the same thing regardless of the defendant's race, but not both. And this dilemma may not be resolvable simply through further technical fixes. Resolving the dilemma requires careful consideration about how these two aspects of fairness fit into our larger tapestry of social values. Moreover, achieving equal error rates for white and Black defendants might mean raising the threshold for being labeled high risk of reoffending for Black defendants. But raising this threshold could lead to mislabeling more high-risk defendants as low-risk defendants and releasing them into society where they harm someone again. So we must also balance public safety against these sort of two competing fairness concerns that we might be concerned about. And almost done here. So I want to close by considering an emerging movement in data and AI ethics that goes beyond these sort of technical and philosophical questions that I've been raising so far. Proponents of what we might call the structural approach ask how new data technologies interact with existing social structures in order to enable unfair or unjust outcomes. So they're interested in sort of diagnosing the root of some of these problems. So on this approach, you cannot disentangle the technological systems from the social systems in which they operate. Key to addressing issues of fairness and justice is addressing the distribution of power in decision-making about how data systems operate. For example, it might not be a coincidence that an overwhelmingly white, Asian, and male tech workforce produced a facial recognition technology that was remarkably bad at identifying Black faces, or that disproportionately labeled tweets by African Americans as offensive. Addressing structural problems often requires a much more activist stance than the technical and philosophical approaches I've been assuming. For example, Mutali Nkondi, now a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society, last year authored and introduced to the US Senate the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which would have the Federal Trade Commission oversee and enforce regulations about privacy and bias risk assessment in artificial intelligence systems. The structural approach might also urge greater effort to diversify data science and technology industries so that their creations are more aligned with the interests and values of all people. So I hope that this brief presentation has given you a sense of some of the emerging technical and ethical challenges facing contemporary work in artificial intelligence and data science, as well as some of the efforts being made to address those challenges. But addressing the challenges will require collaboration. It will require collaboration between legal scholars, computer and data scientists, sociologists, scholars in women's gender and race studies, and philosophy, to name only a few. So thanks for your time. I appreciate it. All done, David. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I should have my video started. Okay. Thank you. What we would like to do now is address your questions. I wanted to ask a question myself to start with, which is whether or not you think that people are highly aware of these kinds of ethical issues. Do you think that there's a kind of a void out there of people knowing how to think about these questions?
Yeah, you know, I do. So I think that in the initial sort of wave and infatuation with big data and artificial intelligence over the last couple of decades, I think that a lot of developers and designers were kind of shooting blindly or stabbing blindly when it came to ethics. And there was a kind of optimism that sort of, given that we're creating these technologies to address important social challenges like communication between people, medical diagnostics, and so on, that they were ethically good technologies. But I think that what we are coming to realize is that there are a lot more challenges associated with data science and artificial intelligence than we appreciated. But I think we're still in the early days of sort of figuring out how to think about these things, and also about how to take those ethical insights and then operationalize them in the technology itself. So thanks.
All right. Well, it seems that people are really interested in your talking about predictive policing. One question says, arrests themselves are biased. Do you think that arrest data can themselves be used for creating fair algorithms, or do we need external information?
I am skeptical about our ability to use arrest data to create fair predictive policing algorithms. I don't think it's a good source of data. There are other options that researchers have floated. So for example, Some have suggested that what you want to do is you want to use emergency calls for service in training those algorithms and in identifying high-risk places, right? The more concentration you have of emergency calls for service, the greater concentration of crime you have in an area. The nice thing about emergency calls for service, that is 911 calls, is that they're generated by the community, right? Community members generate those calls, not police out there looking for crime. And so now, interestingly, predpol, which is the algorithm used by, or it was used by the LAPD until this past spring, the LAPD claimed that that system did not use arrest data in making its forecasts, that it only relied on emergency calls for service and crime reports. Now, there are interesting questions about how good that data is, how good any of that data is, because different communities show different levels of trust in police, right? Or different attitudes towards policing in general. And that might affect the extent to which they call on law enforcement to help them with their problems. Thanks.
Sure, that's very complicated. Another person asks, well, do the police really need algorithms? Are they less fair or more fair than actual people? It seems that people transfer their biases to algorithms. Why not just stick with the people?
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So when it comes to policing, an interesting feature of predictive policing is that it is its efficacy is incredibly understudied. So one of the major critiques of predictive policing systems is that the evidence base is just not there to confirm that it's actually better at preventing crime than human crime analysts. Now, the general idea, so the attraction of predictive policing for police departments, or a couple of them, are that one, in times of budget cuts, having a kind of algorithmic system to do a lot of the work for you allows you to do the work with a smaller group of crime analysts than you might otherwise need. And also, it's true that algorithms, or especially machine learning algorithms, which are sort of trained up to recognize patterns in crime, they can recognize crime patterns that human analysts may not detect. And they can do it they can do it more quickly and for a much wider array of crimes. And so that is the attraction, but I would say that as of right now, the evidence base is not there to suggest that predictive policing is certainly better than human crime analysts.
Thank you. Do you think that, just how conscious do you think that police are of the problems that may exist in these AI systems?
Well, based on the fact that, many police departments are discontinuing their subscriptions to a lot of these systems, that suggests to me that they are becoming aware, at least, of the public critique, and are responsive to that. I recently read the LAPD's strategic plan for the years 2019 to 2021. And that strategic plan, you can find it online. I can also email it to you if you're interested, includes its primary activity of emphasis in the prevention of victimization and crime is data-driven policing. So they stopped using predpol, but they're still very interested in the use of data-driven policing. What I did not see in that document was a great deal of discussion of the issues we've discussed here. They didn't talk about bias or transparency, which is something I didn't raise in this talk. But so I think they're aware of it. I don't know yet the extent to which they're trying to address it, but I hope in some of the work I'm doing as a result of this NSF grant, we're hoping to reach police departments to try to sort of start a conversation with them about these issues.
That's great. Boy, these are great answers. Here's someone who asked something interesting. Could AI be used to actually enhance our ethical practices? It seems like all the talk has been about how AI just makes our prejudices worse.
Yeah.
Is there any way you could train AI to find prejudice in algorithms, for example, and to root them out?
Yeah, I mean, so the last question I want to say is sort of, I think maybe in principle, yes. I'm not a computer scientist, so the technical features of that I don't really want to speak to. But I mean, what I can say is that yes, as I sort of briefly mentioned in the talk, one advantage of using, say, predictive or using algorithmic systems or machine learning systems is that there is a sense in which they're more transparent than human decision makers. Now, people often talk about sort of the opacity or the lack of scrutability of these systems, but you do know, for instance, in the case of the risk scoring algorithm Compass that we talked about, that scored the risk of reoffending for defendants, the information about what factors go into that risk scoring are publicly available. So you know what factors go into that system. And you can tweak the weight of those factors in order to help fix or address some of the issues of bias. That is in some ways an improvement over human decision makers, because we don't know really what's going on in, say, a judge's head when they're deciding how risky a particular defendant is of reoffending, right? Are they more reliable or are they less biased than the predictive system? We don't know. We don't have access to their mental states. So that is a sense in which we might hope that algorithmic systems can improve on human decision making. That is a really important point. I didn't mean for this talk to seem so pessimistic that I didn't think there were ethically valuable uses of artificial intelligence.
I asked you a minute ago if the police were aware that there are problems with these algorithms.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that the writers of the creators of the algorithms, by now they must be hypersensitive to the kinds of problems that they have created in the past through their algorithms that actually made their own, that included certain kinds of discriminations in there.
Yeah.
Do you think that people who are creating algorithms now are using the kind of research that's being done in ethics to improve their products?
I do, actually. And this last one, let me just move this back here. So Temnit Gebru is a research scientist at Google. And she is on Google's ethical AI team. So they actually have an ethical AI team at Google, one of whose charges is to kind of address these concerns that we've been raising here. So I think that some of the big tech firms, at the very least, are highly aware of this stuff. And in many cases, they're leading the charge in trying to sort of incorporate these ethical insights into the design of the tech itself. Microsoft has recently released a suite of tools. I think it's Microsoft. Dave, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. That is designed specifically to help.
IBM.
IBM.
Yep, thanks, Dave. IBM has recently developed a suite of tools designed specifically to help sort of ferret out and correct biases that exist in computer algorithms. So there is definitely growing awareness.
That's great. So let's turn to the thing we're all mostly interested in, which is education. Here's a really good question. What do you think college students need to know about ethics in order to be able to navigate the terrain of artificial intelligence, both programmers and students across many fields and majors?
Yeah. So I think one thing they need to, I think one valuable thing that we can sort of impart to students who are taking off on a data science or a computer science track is just to sort of make them aware that there are ethical issues involved in the conduct of their work, and to sort of make it clear where and how those issues arise. So I've been talking a lot about sort of the sort of internal, the ethical issues that are internal to the practice of data science, right? Algorithms that give sort of racially disparate results, something like that. And I think that's super important stuff. I think it's also important to sort of explain or to sort of get students to sort of understand what the sort of why we ought to be concerned about those types of disparities, right? What's so troubling about those disparities, right? But a second thing that I think is important that I didn't focus on in this talk is to try to convey to students the idea that with great power comes great responsibility, and that firms like Google and Facebook and IBM they're really shaping society about as much as any institution that we have. And you know, take sort of Facebook's ostensible impact on our elections, right? This is not sort of internal to the workings of their algorithm, but it's sort of a larger question about sort of what are the larger social goals that we're trying to achieve when we develop these social media systems or this search engine or whatever. And I think that's those are the types of things that computer science students and data science students could spend more time reflecting on in the classroom and outside of it.
That's great. We're pretty much out of time. I want to ask one more question. I don't want to wear you out. So do you think there might be the chance that people are using algorithms as a way of outsourcing human responsibility? And that this could lead to, you know, more authoritarian, some kind of an authoritarian regime? In other words, the algorithm did it, not us. It's don't blame me. Do you think that's a possibility?
Absolutely. I think that's a very real concern. And I think that you see evidence of that. So there was a recent story by the Tampa Bay Times that was a kind of expose on Pasco County's sheriff's office using an intelligence, they called it an intelligence-led policing program, part of which involved an algorithmic risk scoring system. In the story, right, the expose is that they appeared to be using this to harass high-risk juvenile offenders. So they would spend a lot of time going to their homes and just showing up at their houses and citing their family members for minor offenses like, I don't know, not picking up you know, fallen limbs or something like that in their yard. And so the idea is that this program was a kind of pretext for harassing low-income, high-risk kids. And in response to this expose, you know, the sheriff's office said, look, we thought we were doing something, you know, look, we're just relying on an unbiased algorithm here, right? We tried to take the bias out of it by just putting the data into the system and then going where it told us to go. But what I think is happening here is, and I don't think it's intentional by the sheriff's office at all. And I don't mean to be overly cynical, but I do think there's this sort of phenomenon where by implementing an algorithmic system, this sort of can sometimes prevent an institution like a policing institution from reflecting on their fundamental approach to what they're doing, right? The sort of whether or not we should be policing in this way by going to people's homes and knocking on their doors and citing them for minor offenses in order to root out their juvenile, offending children, right? The algorithm doesn't answer that question, right? And it can't. So.
Okay. Well, I would like to thank you very much for today's workshop. I think we all learned a lot. A whole bunch of people have hung on here right to the very end. And I congratulate you on that. And I think we've all learned a whole lot today. And I, once again, thank you very much for your talk.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Goodbye, everybody.